And we can cross to Hastings in southeast England. Jon Marks is chair of the cross-border information and the editorial director of the Gulf States newsletter. Thanks for joining us here on France 24. Monday morning, waking up, does it feel like 2022 all over again when you look at oil and gas markets?
No, it feels a bit different actually, in a funny sort of way. In fact, it's a thing. If you've been following the industries as long as I have, it's trying to work out which crisis it's like, and in many respects, it's different from any crisis that we've seen for a long time. The actual impacts, clearly from a European perspective, there are real similarities because of the shutting in of the Qatari gas. I mean, remember, after Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine in February 2022, with that awful realization for the Europeans of just how much they were into bed with Russians for their gas supply, Qatar was among the countries that really came to the front. I think you can't overestimate Qatar's importance. It is the world's largest single exporter of liquefied natural gas, and all its strategy and indeed its great wealth has been built around increasing that. So the fact last week, as Hoda said, that force majeure was declared on their output is extreme. But I think for the oil market and the global market, which after all is increasingly revolving around an Asian axis, this is almost unprecedented. The Strait of Hormuz has had risky times in the past, for sure. Ships, including American and British warships, have been in the area in recent years, escorting ships through, and they've been trying to overcome.
Is this the riskiest, John, since the 1980s and the Iran-Iraq war?
Yeah, absolutely. The fact is that the Strait of Hormuz, oil industry is possibly not as centrally important in itself as it was. In the 1970s, everything was about petrol. It was about gas guzzling cars, as we know. That situation has changed. The markets also have changed. But what never happened is actually that closing of that vital seaway. So I'd put it up there with the 1970s. The critical question, of course, is it going to have the long-term consequences that the 70s crisis had, or is it, as I'm sure the American administration believe, Energy Secretary Chris Wright said only yesterday, it's all going to blow over, there won't be a big long-term problem. That's the key question.
So, John, the Gulf states, they have poured billions into the U.S. economy. In exchange, there was U.S. defense. How's that going to look when the guns go silent? How will those Gulf states, will they still be pouring all their money into the United States?
I think the US offering will remain attractive, both strategically, partly because they can't actually, for the time being, live without the US, and also the potential for making money. We've seen very interesting coming together with Gulf states, particularly United Arab Emirates, but also Saudi Arabia, Qatar, looking to life after oil, finding a real alliance with the tech bros who are around Donald Trump. So that will continue, but whether there'll be any level of trust at all, I don't know. From what you can hear coming out of the Gulf capitals, the Americans were fairly clear, those that were actually going to talk about the potentials for military action. Don't worry, we will carry out this action. It will be extremely efficient, which many people would say militarily it has been. And we don't expect there to be any real problem for the energy industry and for yourselves. They were not expecting the blowback. So from that point of view, the actual way that the Iranians lashed out immediately, which they didn't in last June's war, when Israel and the United States attacked their nuclear facilities and many other things, was unexpected, and there are the signs the Americans weren't expecting that to the same extent. And the trust that has now been literally bombed out between those states will be hard to bring back. But you can bet your life that everyone will be looking polite and filled with protocol every time they meet over the next few months.
So you mentioned that, again, the biggest losers from this disruption in the Strait of Hormuz are the big Asian powers like China, like India. What should we expect here in Europe? Again, on a day when we saw here in France the price at the pump for diesel climb above €2.
Yep, it's certainly going up. Diesel's slightly more than unleaded petrol. We're going to have more expensive fuel, that's clear. And with the economic pressures as much here in the south of England as it is in France and in Germany and across the piece, at least we're coming out of winter, because that really would be disastrous. There are, as you say, Francois, there are winners and losers. A lot of the Asian economies are in a bad situation, and you're going to see them turning even more to Russia, unfortunately, for those looking from a European perspective. And it's very interesting. On the quiet last week, the Americans actually gave a sanctions waiver on some exports by Rosneft, the Russian company.
Yeah, for 30 days for India in particular.
That's right. India's the one that's under the most pressure. But remember, India, since Putin's invasion of Ukraine, has gone from being a minimal importer of Russian fuel to importing over 1 million barrels a day. So it really has placed itself in a situation. China is probably in a better situation, but will start hurting. They've got the equivalent of 200 days of imports in reserve, and it's a system I suspect that the Chinese, a situation the Chinese have been looking forward to. Some of the others we've seen today from South Korea are in a very bad situation. So that's big. The gas is potentially even bigger. And of course, the ironic gainer in all this is the newish boy on the block, which was the US liquefied natural gas exports. And America will benefit, American companies, from that hike in the amount that we'll be paying for our gas in Europe, one of the many ironies of this conflict.
Is it a exaggeration, some critics saying we've here in Europe, because of this war, we're going to switch from an overdependence on Russian gas to an overdependence on US liquefied natural gas?
You know, we already see it quite a lot, and it goes into various markets. I look at a lot at Morocco, for example, and they're importing US gas and Qatari through Spain. So yes, there is going to be more. There's always the problem of how much LNG you can bring in, but undoubtedly there will be more US gas. I mean, I think one of the interesting political situations is going to be how much pressure actually comes to reopen some of the gas pipelines that ultimately bring in Russian gas. That's one of those calculations that this conflict is bringing up that I'm sure all governments in Europe really didn't want to have to confront.
Jon Marks, you mentioned earlier how this escalated to DEFCON 4 very fast this time around compared to last June. Let me ask you, though, there are potential targets that have not been struck by either side. There was a big piece in the Financial Times this Monday talking about Karg Island, on which Iran relies for the export of its oil. Why is Donald Trump holding off? Why not go for total war at this point?
Well, trying to guess what Trump's thinking about and what his military planners are thinking is a difficult issue, as we all know. One would assume, particularly as Iranian energy targets have also in the crosshairs, that Kharg Island and indeed other places could be hit. There's actually in the military calculations on both sides an awful lot that hasn't happened yet. As you say, it's a conflict that's gone remarkably quickly. Any conflict that starts with the assassination of a head of state on day one is going to be different from things that we've seen before. And indeed, on the Iranian side, there's also assets that they may have. I know the International Institute of Strategic Studies here in London was talking today about some of the things that the Iranians haven't brought into play, which include cruise missiles, include many more drones. But also, we've not seen, and I've been, and my colleagues have been looking very closely to see if, with Hezbollah under such incredible pressure in Lebanon, whether the Iranians' main allies in the region, the Houthis in Yemen, are going to come into play. We haven't seen them yet. And their record, as we know, against shipping and including the energy industry, is major, and they are not shrinking violets. If there's a fight on, the Houthis will be there.
Jon Marks, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Hastings.